She carried the boy on her hip, shovel in her hand, lips cracked from wind. The man didn't say a word, just handed her a loaf of bread still warm. The dust didn't settle. It lived in the air, a permanent haze that coated the tongue and turned the late afternoon sun a bruised orange. Layla Quist tasted it with every breath. It was the flavor of this life, the grit of survival. The shovel felt heavier today, its handle worn smooth and alien in her palm. She'd been digging for 2 hours trying to carve a new trench to divert the runoff from the lean-to that served as her home. The last storm had sent a river of mud licking at the foundations, and the thought of another one, a real one, made a cold knot tighten in her belly. Toby, her brother, was a solid weight against her side. At 10 months old, he was all soft limbs and trusting sighs, his small head nestled in the crook of her neck. He smelled of milk and sleep and the clean, irreplaceable scent of family. He was the only thing left in this world that didn't taste of dust. She shifted his weight, her muscles screaming a protest that had become as familiar as the ache in her heart. 17 years old, and she felt ancient, worn down to the bone by a responsibility she hadn't asked for, but wouldn't relinquish for anything. That's when she saw him. He was just there, standing at the edge of her pathetic patch of land, where the wiry grass gave up and the cracked earth began. He was a giant of a man, broad-shouldered and solid, a silhouette against the dying light. He wore a heavy sheepskin coat despite the lingering heat of the day, and a hat pulled low, shadowing his face. He'd made no sound. Not a footstep, not a cough. It was as if the ground itself had birthed him whole. Fear, sharp and metallic, shot through her. Men like that, silent men who appeared from nowhere, were rarely a sign of good things. She tightened her grip on the shovel, angling its sharp edge toward him. It was a flimsy defense against a man his size, but it was all she had. Toby stirred, his little hand reaching up to fist in her hair, and a fresh wave of protective fury washed away some of the fear. "What do you want?" Her voice was a croak, raw from the wind and disuse. The man didn't answer. He just stood there, his stillness a stark contrast to the ever-present wind that whipped strands of her brown hair across her face. He seemed to be looking not at her, but at the rickety structure behind her, at the single, sad window patched with greased paper, at the thin curl of smoke rising from the rusted stovepipe. His gaze was slow, methodical, as if he were taking inventory of her poverty. Then he moved. He took one step, then another, his boots making soft, deliberate sounds in the dirt. He wasn't menacing, not exactly. There was a slowness to him, a weight that felt less like a threat and more like a force of nature, like a mountain deciding to shift. He stopped about 10 feet from her. Slowly, as if not to spook a wild animal, he reached into a canvas sack slung over his shoulder. Layla's heart hammered against her ribs. A gun? A knife? She braced herself, ready to swing the shovel, to scream, to do whatever it took to keep Toby safe. But it wasn't a weapon. He pulled out a loaf of bread. It was round and dark, and steam ghosted from its crust into the cool air. He held it out to her, his arm extended. His hand was massive, scarred and calloused, the hand of a man who worked with rock and wood and wire. She stared at the bread, then at his face, trying to see past the shadow of his hat. She could make out a thick, untrimmed beard and a jaw set like stone, but it was his eyes that held her. They were a pale, startling blue, and they weren't looking at her with pity or contempt or any of the other expressions she'd grown so used to. They were just watching, seeing. He took another step, closing the distance between them, and held the bread out further. The smell of it reached her then, warm and yeasty, a scent so full of life and comfort, it made her stomach clench with a hunger she hadn't allowed herself to feel all day. Her hand, the one holding the shovel, trembled. Still, he said nothing. His silence was a physical thing, a presence that filled the space between them. It wasn't an empty silence. It was heavy, weighted with things unsaid. He simply stood there, offering a loaf of bread to a girl with a baby on her hip and a shovel in her hand. Slowly, cautiously, she lowered the shovel until its tip rested in the dirt. She shifted Toby to her other hip, her movements stiff and awkward. Her eyes never left his. She reached out a trembling hand, her fingers brushing against his as she took the offered loaf. It was warm, just as she'd imagined, the crust still crisp. The heat seeped into her cold skin, a small, shocking miracle. He retracted his hand and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Then, just as silently as he had appeared, he turned and walked away. He didn't look back. He just melted back into the vast, indifferent landscape, leaving Layla standing there with the impossible weight of warm bread in her hand. Tears pricked her eyes, hot and sudden. She didn't know if they were tears of fear or confusion or a gratitude so profound it felt like grief. She looked down at Toby, who was now gumming her collar, oblivious. She looked at the loaf of bread, a solid, real thing in a life made of smoke and shadows. And for the first time in a long time, standing on the edge of Barren Spine Ridge, where the dust choked and the storm stripped roofs, she didn't feel entirely alone. The bread lasted 3 days, 3 days of a fullness in her belly that was so unfamiliar it felt like a luxury. She made it last, cutting thin slices for herself and soaking the crusts in a little goat's milk for Toby. Each bite was a reminder of the strange, silent man. She found herself scanning the horizon, her eyes searching the empty expanse for a sign of him. She learned his name from Mr. Abernathy at the outpost store, a place she visited only when absolutely necessary, trading her carefully mended clothes for flour and salt. "That'd be Joran," Abernathy had said, his voice a reedy whisper as he weighed out a small bag of beans. "Lives up on the ridge, rancher, doesn't talk." "Doesn't talk?" Layla had asked, clutching the bag of beans like it was gold. "Not a word. Mute, some say. Or just plain stubborn. Been that way since he showed up a few years back. Keeps to himself. But his cattle are fat and his fences are strong. Pays in coin. Never complains." Abernathy had squinted at her then, his eyes sharp and curious. "Why you asking about Joran?" Layla had just shrugged, her face burning. "No reason, just saw him is all." She didn't see him again for a week. The memory of the warm bread began to feel like a dream, a hallucination brought on by hunger and exhaustion. The runoff trench was finished, a ragged scar in the earth, but it held. She spent her days in a grinding routine, boiling Toby's bottles in a pot over the fire, washing their few clothes and hanging them on a wire strung between the lean-to and a gnarled juniper tree, mending, cleaning, surviving. The nights were the hardest. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, and the darkness outside the single window was absolute. She'd lie on her thin pallet, Toby asleep in his makeshift crib beside her, and listen to the sounds of the night. Every creak of the wood, every skittering sound on the roof, sent a jolt of fear through her. This land was unforgiving. It took and rarely gave back. It had taken her parents, a fever sweeping through their small homestead with the swift, merciless efficiency of a prairie fire. It had left her with a baby brother, a mountain of debt to Abernathy, and a future that felt as bleak and empty as the landscape around her. Then, one evening, as the sun was setting, she saw him again. He was at the far edge of her property, not near the lean-to this time, but by the section of fence that had been trampled by wild horses a month ago. She hadn't had the strength or the materials to fix it properly, and had made do with a flimsy patchwork of branches and wire. He had a bundle of fresh-cut fence posts slung over his shoulder and a coil of new wire in his hand. He didn't look at her. He just dropped the posts to the ground with a solid thud, pulled a post-hole digger from where he'd leaned it against a rock, and began to work. Layla stood in the doorway of the lean-to, Toby on her hip, and watched. The rhythmic thump of the digger was a steady, reassuring sound in the vast silence. He worked with an economy of motion, his powerful body moving with a practiced grace. He dug the holes, set the posts, and stretched the wire, his movements sure and efficient. He didn't rush, but he didn't waste a single motion. The sun bled out of the sky, leaving streaks of purple and pink. The air grew cold. Layla shivered, pulling the thin shawl tighter around her and Toby. She should have gone inside, should have lit the lamp and started their meager supper. But she couldn't. She was mesmerized by the sight of him, a silent guardian rebuilding a barrier she couldn't manage on her own. He finished, as dusk settled into night. The fence was straight and strong, a dark line against the fading light. He gathered his tools, his face still in shadow. He didn't look toward the lean-to, didn't give any sign that he knew she was watching. He just turned and walked away, disappearing into the gathering darkness. Layla walked out to the new fence, her boots sinking into the soft dirt. She ran her hand over the smooth, sturdy wood of a post. It was solid, real, a gift given without a word, without a request for thanks. That night when the wind howled, it sounded a little less like a wolf and a little more like a song. His visits became a silent ritual. He never came to the door, never sought her out. He would just appear, a quiet presence at the edge of her world, and leave something she needed. A sack of potatoes on the woodpile, a bundle of freshly chopped firewood, stacked neatly by her door. Once, a small, carefully wrapped package that contained a length of soft, warm flannel. She used it to line Toby's crib, her fingers tracing the smooth fabric with a sense of wonder. She never knew when he would come. Days, sometimes a week, would pass with no sign of him. During those times, a familiar anxiety would creep back in, the feeling of being utterly alone in a world that was too big and too hard. Then, just as the last of the potatoes was gone or the woodpile was dwindling, she would find a new offering, a silent testament to his watchfulness. She began to leave things for him in return. A jar of wild berry jam she'd made, a small token of her gratitude. She'd place it on the new fence post, and the next day, it would be gone. She left a few of the biscuits she'd made, carefully wrapped in a clean cloth. They disappeared too. It was a silent conversation, a barter of kindness in a world that usually demanded a much higher price. One afternoon she was trying to fix the wobbly leg of Toby's crib. It was a crudely made thing, built by her father from scavenged wood. One of the legs had split, and the whole thing threatened to collapse. She was trying to bind it with a piece of twine, her fingers clumsy and her frustration mounting. Toby was on a blanket on the floor, fussing, and the sound grated on her already frayed nerves. She heard a soft, scraping sound outside. Her head snapped up, her heart giving a familiar little jump. She went to the door and peered out. Joran was there, standing by the woodpile. He was holding an axe. For a terrifying second, the old fear returned. But he wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the axe in his hand, then at the pile of uncut logs beside the woodpile. Her own axe was a pathetic thing, its blade chipped and its handle loose. Chopping wood was a torturous, exhausting chore. He seemed to understand. He laid his axe, a beautiful, well-cared-for tool with a sharp, gleaming blade, on top of the log pile. Then he picked up her old, battered axe and walked away. Layla stared at the axe he'd left behind. It was a trade, a silent, stunningly generous trade. That evening, she chopped wood with an ease that felt miraculous. The blade bit deep into the logs, splitting them cleanly with a satisfying thwack. The scent of fresh-cut pine filled the air, a clean, sharp smell that cleared her head and eased the tension in her shoulders. The next day, as she was boiling Toby's bottle in the pot, she saw him on the ridge, far in the distance, a tiny figure moving against the vast sky. He was using her old axe, swinging it with the same steady rhythm she'd come to recognize. And she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that he was watching over her. The crib remained broken. The axe, as wonderful as it was, couldn't fix everything. Layla tried everything she could think of. More twine, a wedge of wood, a prayer, but the leg just got wobblier. She was terrified that it would collapse while Toby was sleeping. She started putting him to sleep in a laundry basket lined with blankets, but it was too small, and he'd wake up crying, his little limbs cramped. One morning, she woke to the sound of sawing, not the rhythmic chopping of an axe, but the steady, rasping sound of a handsaw. She crept to the window, her heart in her throat. Joran was on her porch. Her porch. He had never come this close before. He had a toolbox open on the ground beside him, a collection of well-cared-for tools that gleamed in the morning sun, and he was carefully, methodically repairing Toby's crib. He had removed the broken leg and was fashioning a new one from a piece of wood. She watched, breathless, as he worked. His massive hands, which she'd seen lift heavy fence posts and swing an axe, were surprisingly gentle and precise. He measured, sawed, and sanded, his movements focused and unhurried. He worked for over an hour, his silence a comforting presence rather than an unnerving one. When he was finished, the crib was sturdier than it had ever been. The new leg was a perfect fit, the wood smooth and seamless. He tested it, pushing down on it with his full weight. It didn't budge. He gave a slight nod of satisfaction, packed up his tools, and stood to leave. Layla opened the door. She had to say something. She couldn't let this incredible act of kindness pass without acknowledgement. "Wait," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He stopped, his back to her. He didn't turn around. "Thank you," she said, the words feeling small and inadequate. For everything." He stood there for a long moment, his broad back a wall between them. Then he lifted a hand and gave a slight wave, a gesture of dismissal or acknowledgement. She wasn't sure which. And then he was gone. Layla went to the crib and ran her hand over the new leg. It was made from a different wood than the rest of the crib, a darker, richer color. She recognized it. It was the same wood as the porch of his small, distant cabin, a porch she'd only seen from afar. He had taken a piece of his own home to repair hers. She picked Toby up from the laundry basket and placed him gently in the newly repaired crib. He cooed, stretching out his little limbs, safe and secure. Layla leaned against the crib, her forehead resting on the cool, smooth wood, and cried. She didn't cry from fear or sorrow. She cried from a relief so overwhelming it felt like a physical release, a breaking of a dam inside her. In the silence of her small, broken-down lean-to, in the vast, unforgiving wilderness of barren Spine Ridge, she had been seen. She was not invisible, and that, more than any words, was a promise of hope. Winter came to the ridge not as a gentle blanket of white, but as a snarling beast. The wind screamed down from the mountains, a physical force that rattled the very bones of the lean-to. Snow fell in thick, blinding sheets, burying the world in a cold, silent shroud. For days, Layla and Toby were trapped inside, the world reduced to the small, cramped space of their single room. The firewood Joran had provided was a lifeline, a bulwark against the killing cold. The flannel he'd given her was a shield for Toby against the drafts that snaked through the walls. But as the storm raged on, a new fear began to gnaw at her. Their food was running low. The small sack of flour was almost empty, the last of the potatoes had been boiled, and the goat's milk was gone. She rationed what was left, giving most of it to Toby, her own hunger a dull, constant ache in her belly. She tried not to think about what would happen when the food ran out completely. The outpost was miles away, an impossible journey in this weather. There was no one to turn to, no one to ask for help. The vast, white world outside was as empty and indifferent as the sky. On the fourth day of the storm, she used the last of the flour to make a thin, watery gruel for Toby. As she was feeding him, she heard a sound, a heavy, rhythmic thudding, coming from the direction of the door. It wasn't the wind. It was something else. Her heart leaped into her throat. Who would be out in this? A lost traveler? Someone in trouble? Or something worse? She grabbed the fireplace poker, her hand trembling, and crept toward the door. The thudding continued, steady and deliberate. She peered through a crack in the doorframe. All she could see was a wall of swirling snow. But then, A shape began to resolve itself out of the white chaos. A massive figure covered in snow, a sheepskin coat a ghostly white. Joran. He was clearing a path to her door, his shovel rising and falling with a powerful, relentless rhythm. He had walked here, through the blizzard, through miles of deep, drifting snow. He hadn't brought anything, no sack of food or bundle of wood. He had just come. When he reached the door, he stopped, his chest heaving, his beard encrusted with ice. He looked up and met her eyes through the crack in the door. He didn't try the handle, didn't knock. He just stood there, a silent sentinel in the storm, waiting. Layla fumbled with the latch, her fingers numb with cold and shock. She pulled the door open, and a blast of wind and snow rushed in. Joran didn't move. He just looked at her, then at Toby in her arms, his pale blue eyes taking in the scene, the empty pot on the stove, the fear in her eyes. Without a word, he turned and gestured for her to follow. He started back the way he came, wading into the deep snow, creating a path for her with his own body. Layla hesitated for only a second. She wrapped Toby in every blanket she owned, grabbed the bag with his bottles and a few diapers, and stepped out into the storm. The journey to his cabin was a waking nightmare. The wind tore at her, the snow blinded her, and the cold seeped into her bones. But Joran was a shield. He walked ahead of her, his broad back breaking the force of the wind, his steady progress a beacon in the white wilderness. When she stumbled, a large hand would appear, gripping her arm, steadying her, and then retreating. His cabin was small and square, built of thick, sturdy logs, with a low roof that hugged the ground. It looked like it had grown out of the earth, as solid and unyielding as the man who had built it. Inside, it was a single room, dominated by a large stone fireplace where a fire blared, casting a warm, dancing light on the rough-hewn walls. The air was warm and smelled of wood smoke and coffee. It was a man's space, sparse and functional. A narrow bed in one corner, a table and 2 chairs, shelves filled with tools and jars of preserves. But it was clean, and it was warm, and it was safe. Joran gestured toward the fire, then went to a cupboard and took out a pot and a sack of oats. He moved with the same silent efficiency she'd come to know, starting a pot of oatmeal, his movements sure and comforting in their familiarity. Layla sank into a chair by the fire, her body trembling with exhaustion and relief. She unwrapped Toby, who had slept through the entire ordeal, and held him close, his small, warm body a comfort against her own. She watched Joran as he worked, his silence no longer a mystery, but a language she was beginning to understand. It was the language of action, of provision, of a protection so profound it needed no words. He brought her a bowl of oatmeal, thick and hot and sweetened with molasses. It was the best thing she had ever tasted. As she ate, the warmth spread through her, chasing away the last of the cold, and a feeling of safety, a feeling she hadn't realized she'd been missing so desperately, settled over her. She was raising her baby brother alone, in a world that was determined to break her. But in the heart of a blizzard, in the silent cabin of a mute rancher, she had found a sanctuary. And she knew, with a certainty that was as solid and real as the stone fireplace before her, that she was no longer fighting this battle by herself. They lived in a silent rhythm, a shared solitude. The storm raged for 3 more days, and the cabin became their world. Layla took care of Toby, washing his diapers in a bucket of heated snowmelt, boiling his bottles by the fire. Joran took care of everything else. He kept the fire roaring, cooked their meals, simple, hearty fare like stew and cornbread, and shoveled the path to the outhouse, a constant battle against the endlessly drifting snow. They rarely looked at each other directly, but they were acutely aware of each other's presence. Layla would watch him out of the corner of her eye as he mended a piece of tack, his large hands surprisingly nimble. He would watch her as she sang a soft lullaby to Toby, his pale eyes unreadable in the firelight. One evening, as she was rocking a fussy Toby by the fire, the baby's cries sharp and thin in the quiet cabin, Joran got up from the table where he was oiling a rifle. He went to a small carved wooden chest in the corner and took something out. He came to her and held it out. It was a wooden bird, crudely carved but with a surprising amount of detail, its wings slightly spread as if in mid-flight. Layla took it, her fingers brushing his. The wood was smooth and warm. She dangled it in front of Toby, and the baby's cries immediately subsided. His little hands reached for the bird, his eyes wide with fascination. He cooed, batting at the toy, a gurgle of laughter escaping his lips. Layla looked up at Joran, a question in her eyes. He simply pointed to the chest, then to himself, a gesture that was both a confession and an explanation. He had made this, for a child that wasn't his. A different kind of silence settled between them then, a silence that was not about the absence of words, but the presence of a shared, unspoken understanding. He was not just a protector, he was a caregiver, in his own quiet way. When the storm finally broke, the world outside was a dazzling, pristine white. The sun on the snow was blinding. It was time to go back. Layla felt a strange reluctance, a pang of regret. The lean-to, with its drafts and its flimsy walls, felt a world away from the solid safety of this cabin. Joran seemed to understand. He packed a sack with food, a side of bacon, a bag of beans, a jar of his own preserved peaches. He strapped it to a small sled he'd made, then gestured for her to put Toby on it as well, bundled in his blankets. The walk back was easier. The world was quiet, the only sound the crunch of their boots in the snow and the soft shush of the sled. When they reached the lean-to, it was half buried in snow, looking smaller and more fragile than ever. Joran didn't just leave her at the door. He spent the rest of the day helping her dig out, shoveling the heavy snow from the roof, clearing a path to the woodpile. When he was done, he turned to leave. "Joran," Layla said, her voice soft. He stopped, his back to her. She didn't know what to say. The words "thank you" felt so ridiculously small. How could she thank him for saving their lives? For the food, the shelter, the warmth, for the carved bird that Toby was now clutching in his sleep. She took a deep breath. "Your axe," she said, pointing to the beautiful, sharp axe he had traded for her own. "You should take it back." He shook his head, a small, definite gesture. Then he pointed to her, to Toby in her arms, and then back at the axe. It was hers. It was for them. He walked away, his broad shoulders a familiar sight against the backdrop of snow and sky. Layla watched him go, a lump in her throat. She looked at the strong, straight fence, the neat pile of firewood, the axe leaning against the wall. She looked at the sturdy, repaired crib inside, and the sleeping baby who held a small wooden bird. These were the things that mattered. Not promises, not words, just the quiet, steady presence of a man who had stepped out of the shadows and built a wall of silent kindness around them. The spring was a time of slow healing. The snow melted, revealing the scarred and battered land. Layla planted a small garden, a hopeful row of beans and squash, her hands turning the cold, damp earth. Toby began to crawl, his world expanding from the confines of the lean-to to the small, sun-drenched patch of dirt outside the door. Joran's visits continued, as silent and predictable as the changing seasons. He never came empty-handed. A sack of seed potatoes, a few laying hens, which he housed in a small, sturdy coop he built in an afternoon, a new, warmer blanket for her bed. He would leave his offerings and disappear, a ghost of generosity. Layla's offerings became more frequent as well. A basket of the first eggs from the hens, a jar of cool water left on the fence post on a hot day, the first small, tender squash from her garden. It was a silent, delicate dance of give and take, a relationship built not on words, but on shared needs and quiet acts of grace. The outpost, with its prying eyes and gossiping tongues, began to notice. When Layla went to the store for salt or thread, she could feel their stares, hear their whispered conversations. She was the young girl living alone with a baby, the one the mute rancher seemed to have taken under his wing. They didn't understand it, and what they didn't understand, they feared or condemned. One day, a man named Brody, a drifter who did odd jobs around the outpost, cornered her outside Abernathy's store. He was a lean, wiry man with shifty eyes and a cruel smile. "Heard you got a protector," Brody said, his voice slick with insinuation. He blocked her path, his presence too close, too invasive. That dumb giant on the ridge. What's he get in return for all his charity, huh? Layla's face flushed. She clutched Toby tighter, her heart pounding. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, I think you do," Brody sneered, his eyes raking over her. "A pretty little thing like you, all alone out there. Must get lonely." Fear, cold and sharp, coiled in her gut. She tried to push past him, but he grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her skin. "Let go of me," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "Or what?" he challenged, his face close to hers. "Your silent friend ain't here to save you now." Suddenly, a shadow fell over them. Brody's smirk faltered. He looked up, and the color drained from his face. Joran was standing right behind him, his presence as sudden and silent as a thunderclap. He hadn't made a sound, but his stillness was more menacing than any shout. He just looked at Brody, his pale blue eyes flat and cold as ice. He didn't have to do anything else. Brody's hand dropped from Layla's arm as if he'd been burned. He stammered something, an apology or an excuse, and then scrambled away, almost falling over his own feet in his haste. Joran watched him go, his expression unchanging. Then he looked at Layla. He looked at the red marks on her arm where Brody's fingers had been, and a muscle twitched in his jaw. It was the most emotion she had ever seen on his face. He looked at Toby, who had started to cry, and his expression softened almost imperceptibly. He reached out, not to her, but to the sack of flour she had dropped. He picked it up, his movements slow and deliberate, and handed it to her. Then he turned and walked beside her, escorting her all the way back to the lean-to. He didn't leave until she and Toby were safely inside, the door bolted behind them. He didn't say a word, but his message was clear. She was not to be touched. She was under his protection. The summer burned hot and dry. The garden withered, despite Layla's best efforts to keep it watered. The dust returned, a constant gritty film on everything. But the hens laid their eggs, and Toby thrived. He was walking now, a determined, wobbly toddler who explored his small world with a fearless curiosity. Joran's presence became a more constant feature of her life. He would often be there in the evenings, sitting on her porch, not saying a word, just watching as she did her chores and Toby played in the dirt. His silence was a comfort, a shield against the loneliness of the vast, empty land. One evening, as she was hanging their clothes on the wire, her own patched dress, Toby's small shirts, and a pair of Joran's work pants he had torn on a fence and she had mended for him, she was struck by the simple domesticity of the scene. 2 sets of clothes, from 2 separate lives, hanging together in the fading light. A strange, unexpected family, born of necessity and forged in silence. She looked at him, sitting on the porch step, his massive frame relaxed, his eyes on the horizon. A question burned in her, a question she had never dared to ask, a question she wasn't even sure she wanted the answer to. Why? Why her? Why was he doing all of this? But she didn't ask. The silence between them was too precious, too full of unspoken trust, to break with a question he couldn't, or wouldn't, answer. She finished hanging the clothes and went to sit on the step beside him, leaving a respectful distance between them. They sat there together, watching the stars begin to prick the darkening sky. 2 solitary figures sharing a silence that was more profound than any conversation. The arrival of the circuit judge was an event at the outpost. It happened twice a year, a brief imposition of law and order on a land that mostly governed itself. With him came a man Layla had hoped never to see again, her uncle, Silas Quist. He was her father's brother, a man with a sour face and a heart to match. He had disapproved of her parents' marriage, of their move to this God-forsaken land, of the very fact of her existence. After their deaths, He had made a brief, perfunctory appearance, looked at the debt, the baby, and the 17-year-old girl left to manage it all, and declared it a hopeless situation. He had offered to take Toby, to have him raised by a proper family back east. But Layla had refused, clinging to her brother with the ferocity of a she-wolf. Silas had left, disgusted, but not before vowing that she was unfit, that the boy deserved better. Now, he was back, and he had the law on his side. He came to the lean-to with the judge, a portly man with a self-important air, and the town sheriff, a man who mostly kept the peace by staying out of people's business. Silas didn't even look at Layla. He just pointed at the lean-to, at the dusty yard, at the patched window. "You see, Your Honor?" Silas said, his voice dripping with sanctimonious concern. "This is no place for a child. She's a child herself. She can't provide for him. He's malnourished, living in squalor. I'm his only living relative, and it's my duty to see him properly cared for." The judge looked at Layla, his eyes cold and assessing. He saw a young girl, thin and worn, with dust on her dress and fear in her eyes. He saw a baby playing in the dirt with a wooden bird. He didn't see the love, the sacrifice, the fierce, unyielding determination that had kept them both alive. "Ma'am," the judge said, his voice officious, "I have a sworn statement here from your uncle, Silas Quist. He is petitioning for custody of the boy, Tobias Quist, on the grounds of neglect and your own inability to provide a suitable home." Layla's blood ran cold. "That's not true," she said, her voice shaking. "Toby is fine. He's healthy. I take care of him." "Do you?" the judge asked, his gaze sweeping over their meager home. "It doesn't look like much of a life for a boy." Toby, sensing the tension, started to cry. He toddled over to Layla and clung to her leg, his small face buried in her skirt. Layla wrapped her arms around him, her body a shield. "He's my brother," she said, her voice rising with a desperate edge. "You can't take him from me." "It's for his own good, Layla," Silas said, his voice a mockery of sympathy. "He'll have a real home, a mother and a father, a future." The judge nodded gravely. "The law is clear. In the absence of suitable parental care, the next of kin has a claim. And frankly, ma'am, I'm inclined to agree with Mr. Quist. This is no environment for a child." He motioned to the sheriff. "Take the boy." Panic, pure and absolute, seized Layla. She screamed, a raw, primal sound of agony and rage. She held on to Toby with all her strength, but the sheriff was a big man, and he pried her fingers away, one by one. Toby shrieked, his small arms reaching for her, his face a mask of terror. Silas took the crying child from the sheriff, a look of triumph on his sour face. "It's for the best," he said, not meeting her eyes. Layla fell to her knees in the dust, a sob tearing from her throat. She watched them walk away with her brother, her entire world, her reason for breathing. The light seemed to drain from the sky, the air turned to ash in her lungs. She was empty, broken. She stayed there, on her knees in the dirt for how long she didn't know. The sun beat down on her, but she didn't feel it. The world had gone silent, the only sound the ragged, tearing sound of her own grief. Then a shadow fell over her. She looked up, her eyes blurred with tears, and saw Joran. He was standing there, his face a granite mask, but his eyes were filled with a cold, terrifying fury. He looked at the retreating figures of the judge and Silas, and then he looked at her empty arms and her broken heart. He knelt in the dust in front of her. He put a hand on her shoulder, his touch surprisingly gentle. And then he did something he had never done before. He spoke. His voice was a low, rough sound, like rocks grinding together, a sound born of long disuse. It was just one word, but it was a vow, a promise, a declaration of war. "No." He stood up, towering over her, a figure of implacable strength. He looked at her one more time, a look of fierce, unwavering resolve in his pale blue eyes. Then he turned and started walking, not running, but walking with a long, deliberate stride in the direction of the outpost. He was going to bring him back. The walk to the outpost was the longest of Joran's life. With every step, the dust of the road was the dust of memory, the grit of a past he had tried to bury. He had come to barren Spine Ridge to be silent, to let the world forget him, to let the man he had been die. For years it had worked. The silence had been a fortress, a penance. But now, that fortress had been breached. The girl and the boy had, without trying, found the cracks in his walls. They had planted a garden in the barren soil of his life, and now someone had come to tear it out by the roots. He would not allow it. He could feel the eyes on him as he walked down the single, dusty street of the outpost, the mute rancher, the ghost of the ridge, walking into town in the middle of the day. It was an event. People stopped and stared. He ignored them. His focus was on the small, clapboard building that served as the judge's temporary courthouse. He didn't knock. He just opened the door and walked in. The room was small and stuffy, smelling of stale cigar smoke and self-importance. The judge was behind a makeshift desk, Silas Quist standing beside him, looking smug. The sheriff stood by the door, looking uneasy. And in the corner, on a bench, was Toby, his face red and blotchy with tears, his small body trembling. All conversation stopped. Every eye in the room turned to Joran. The judge, flustered by the interruption, banged a small gavel on the desk. "Here now! What is the meaning of this? This is a private proceeding." Joran ignored him. His eyes were locked on Silas Quist. He walked toward him, his steps slow and heavy, each one a hammer blow in the silent room. Silas, who had looked so triumphant moments before, shrank back, his face paling. "Sheriff, remove this man," the judge ordered, his voice high and thin. The sheriff took a hesitant step forward, then stopped. He had seen the look in Joran's eyes. It was a look that promised a world of pain. Joran stopped directly in front of Silas. He was a head taller, a foot broader. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The quiet fury radiating from him was more powerful than any shout. "He stays," Joran said. His voice was rougher now, more gravelly, but the word was clear, undeniable. Silas sputtered. "You have no say in this. I'm his uncle. The law is on my side." Joran's gaze was unwavering. "You are nothing to him." He turned his head slightly, his eyes for the first time acknowledging the judge. He pointed a thick, scarred finger at Silas. "This man abandoned them, left them to starve." He then pointed to himself. "I provided wood, food, a home." The judge looked from the massive, furious rancher to the sniveling, terrified Silas. The official papers on his desk suddenly seemed flimsy, irrelevant in the face of the raw, undeniable truth standing before him. "Is this true, Mr. Quist?" the judge asked, his tone shifting. "Did you leave a 17-year-old girl to care for a baby alone in this wilderness?" Silas couldn't meet Joran's eyes. He stared at the floor, his face a mottled red. She was stubborn. She wouldn't listen to reason." Joran took another step forward, and Silas flinched as if he'd been struck. Joran looked down at him, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "She has more reason in her little finger than you have in your entire worthless body. She is his mother, in all the ways that count." He turned back to the judge, his expression softening almost imperceptibly as his gaze fell on Toby, who had stopped crying and was now watching him with wide, curious eyes. "A home is not four walls. A home is not a piece of paper. A home is love, protection." He looked back at the judge, his pale blue eyes burning with an intensity that made the man squirm in his chair. "He is not leaving her. I will not allow it." There was a long, tense silence. The judge looked at Joran, at the quiet, unshakable strength of the man. He looked at Silas, at his greed and his weakness, and he looked at the small boy who was now holding out his arms, not toward his uncle, but toward the silent giant who had just spoken for him. The judge cleared his throat. He picked up the custody papers and, with a decisive gesture, tore them in half. "The petition is denied," he said, his voice firm. "The boy stays with his sister." He looked at Joran. "You will see to their welfare?" Joran gave a single sharp nod. He walked over to the bench and gently lifted Toby into his arms. The boy went without protest, his small head nestling into the familiar, safe space on Joran's shoulder. Joran turned, gave Silas one last look of utter contempt, and walked out of the courthouse, back into the sunlight. He carried the boy all the way back to the lean-to. When Layla saw them coming, a silhouette against the setting sun, the man and the boy, her heart, which she thought had shattered into a million pieces, began to stitch itself back together. She ran to them, her feet flying over the dusty ground. She didn't say a word. She just reached for her brother, her arms wrapping around him, tears of relief streaming down her face. She buried her face in his soft hair, breathing in his familiar scent, holding him so tight he squawked in protest. She looked up at Joran, her eyes full of a gratitude so immense it was beyond words. His face was unreadable, his pale eyes watching her, his silence having returned as if it had never left. He had spoken. He had broken his long vow of silence for them. He had brought her world back to her. He stayed for a while, sitting on the porch step in the gathering dusk, watching as she fed Toby his dinner, his presence a comforting, solid anchor in her tumultuous world. The quiet that settled between them was different now. It was deeper, richer, imbued with the memory of his voice, with the weight of the words he had chosen to speak. When he finally stood to leave, Layla stood as well. She looked at this strange, silent man who had become her protector, her provider, her friend. She looked at his scarred hands, his broad shoulders, his quiet, watchful eyes. And she knew that some things, the most important things, were understood without ever being said. She never asked why he helped, and he never asked to stay.